You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Dr. Tony Freeth. Dr. Tony Freeth is a founding member of the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project and an Honorary Senior Research Associate at University College London. He holds degrees in mathematics from Cambridge University and Bristol University. His work on the Antikythera mechanism has been published in the journal Nature, as well as other prominent journals.
Dr. Tony Freeth, welcome back to the program, actually. Now, Doctor, you have worked extensively with the Antikythera mechanism, one of the most compelling and interesting archaeological finds we've ever made in the history of archaeology. And this object puzzled people for many years. It was found, about 123 years ago now. And we now have a fairly good idea through your work of what this object really did and how it worked. What were the circumstances of the finding of this object in, I believe, 1900?
Well, it was the original wreck site was found in 1900 by a party of Greek sponge divers who came from a small island in the eastern Mediterranean called Symi. And sponge diving in the Mediterranean is pretty much fished out by then, and they were actually traveling to sponge fishing grounds in North Africa. And when they reached this tiny island called Antikythera between Crete and mainland Greece, they encountered a very severe storm and had to take shelter from the storm. Then the Captain Kondos of the expedition, sent down the youngest diver called Elias Stadiatis to see if there might possibly be some sponges in the local waters. And he came up a few minutes later, and apparently he was shaking in fear. And he said he'd seen a heap of dead, naked people underwater. So the captain donned their diving suit. In those days, they were using these suits with big brass and copper helmets and canvas suits with pumped air. Very cumbersome. He put on the suit and he went down. And he found that the dead, naked people were marble and bronze sculptures lying on the seafloor, scattered on the seafloor. And he recovered a bronze arm, which he brought up on board the ship. Then apparently they went on to their North African sponge diving grounds and went back to Symi. And there was much debate between them as to whether they should tell the authorities about this find of this wreck, or should maybe just go back and make their own discoveries later on. But it did come to the attention of the authorities, and they quickly realized that it was very important. Bronze sculptures are very rare and valuable. And the Greek government set up an expedition. They commissioned the original sponge divers to do the diving. And they started in the autumn of 1900, but they encountered a lot of bad weather and didn't bring up much through the rest of 1900. But when they resumed, when the weather got better in 1901, they started to bring up a huge array of stuff. It was a very big vessel by ancient Greek standards. It was stuffed full of Greek treasure. It had wonderful bronze sculptures. It had these huge marble sculptures on board, many of them rather badly corroded. It had this superb glassware, some of it brought up completely intact through the skill of the sponge divers. It had a lot of pottery. It had some jewelry. It had some furniture fitments and a bronze lyre and many wonderful objects, which are all in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens to this day. And they also brought up this sort of completely rather nondescript lump. There's some debate about this, but I believe it was almost certainly in one piece at this stage. And they recovered it because it was partly green, and green indicated bronze corrosion, so that it might have something bronze inside. And everything from the wreck was taken to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens and put in various places, some in an outside cage, in heaps to be examined later, And they identified the obviously valuable objects and started to examine those. And it wasn't until months later that a visiting MP called Spiridon Stice chanced on this lump, and it had split apart. And inside, he noticed these tiny gear wheels. They're really small. They're about the size of coins, tiny teeth about 1 millimeter long. And it was a shocking discovery, because such gear wheels simply should not have existed in ancient Greece. They knew about gears from watermills and windmills, but these are precision gears, mathematical gears for making calculations. And that was a huge shock.
And of course, that there begins the cultural story of this, because everybody at that point started speculating, well, what are these gears? And I've been aware of the mechanism since I was a little kid in the 1970s. So this has been on the table, but there have been a lot of misinterpretations of it because it's so complicated. And figuring out just what it did has been somewhat elusive, right? I mean, what was the history of the interpretation of this artifact?
Well, the early researchers, once this amazing discovery of these gear wheels had been made, a lot of quite distinguished researchers came in, experts on Greek language. Quite a lot of naval officers seemed to take an interest in it. And it was variously thought to be either a navigation instrument, it'd come from a ship, so that it seemed like a plausible sort of explanation, or an astrolabe, which is a device for tracking the stars. And in fact, it was neither. They just got it all wrong, basically. They found some inscriptions on some of it. I think they found the inscription Aphrodite, which is the planet Venus. So it wasn't that they made no progress, but they didn't really understand it. And then in 1905 to 1906, a German philologist called Albert Riem started to study it very seriously. And he made these extraordinarily perceptive discoveries about it. He didn't solve it. He didn't come anywhere close to solving it. He got nearly everything wrong about it, but he made these remarkable discoveries. And one of the first things he found was on one plate, in one of the fragments. By this time, it was split into many different fragments. And the history of how it became split into those fragments is obscured in history. It's not really understood. But on one fragment called fragment C, I should say there are 82 fragments now. The main fragments, the largest fragments, are lettered A, B, C to G, 7 fragments. And then there's 75 small fragments that are numbered 1 to 75. Some of them just the size of your fingernail, are tiny. And Riem noticed on a plate in this fragment C that there was quite a lot of readable text that he could see on the surface. And he transcribed all this text, and he identified it as a star calendar, which is known as a parapegma in ancient Greece. And there was a whole tradition of these parapegmata, as they were called. And they listed the risings and settings of the stars in the annual cycle. So he clearly identified it as being astronomical. And then he started to explore the gearing. And he made some extraordinary suggestions that it included not only the straightforward gears that you'd get in a mechanical clock. If you imagine a sort of 18th, 19th century mechanical clock, it has gears, and they all sit in fixed axes that are turn in plates. But he suggested that some of the gearing was so-called epicyclic, that some of the gears were mounted on other gears, so their axes were turning around with other gears. An extraordinarily sophisticated, hard to understand sort of gearing. Absolutely astonishing. But he turned out to be right, and he turned out to be crucially right about this. This was very, very important discovery by Riem. He also suggested that it was a planetarium, and he did a whole diagram of how it might have displayed the 5 planets. They knew 5 planets in the ancient world. Again, he's been completely vindicated about this. I think most people now believe that it did contain a planetarium, but he didn't have enough data to really unravel the structure of it and how it worked. And so his sort of speculative gear diagrams and models, we now look at them and we think they're all wrong. But his insight into what it might have done, his prescience, was quite extraordinary. And a lot of his ideas are incorporated into the latest model of the Antikythera mechanism. I can't go through the whole history of research on this thing, but the next major figure really was 50 years later, a man called Derek de Solla Price, who was a physicist by origin, British physicist, did a PhD in physics, and then he became a historian of science, and he became fascinated with the Antikythera mechanism. And absolutely crucially, he commissioned the first X-ray study of the device. See, on the fragments, you can see quite a lot of gears on the surface. Price identified maybe, 20 gears on the surface and wrote an article in Scientific American in 1959, which showed how he thought the fragments went together, which was quite a good start. But he didn't understand the gearing. He got if you want to understand what a geared mechanism does, you need to count the teeth to see what it calculates. And he got nearly all the tooth counts. 17 out of his 20 tooth counts were wrong. But he was very persistent, and he then commissioned an X-ray study with a Greek radiologist called Charalambos Karakalos, who worked with his wife, Emily, on X-ray studies. And they did a lot of quite high-quality 2D X-rays, hard to interpret because all the gears it's 2D, all the gears overlap. They counted the teeth, and they started to make progress with this. The tooth counts started to be much better than Price's original tooth counts. But they also started to have arguments between the Karakalos family and Price, because Price, there's one well-known gear, which we now call D2, which the Karakalos family said they thought had 128 teeth. All these gears, they're mostly partial gears, so you get runs of teeth and then a lot of teeth missing. This gear, there's quite a lot of teeth. I think it's about 2/3 of the teeth at present. But Price said he thought it had 127 teeth, which seems like a small difference. But in fact, it was very important because 127 is the large prime factor. It's half of 254, which was the number of sidereal cycles of the moon against the stars, the rotation of the moon against the stars in a 19-year cycle from an ancient Babylonian cycle. And this had been found, in fact, earlier by Albert Ream in the inscriptions. He found the numbers 19 and the numbers 76 and 223 in the inscriptions. These all turned out to be, two of them Babylonian cycles and one a Greek refinement. I should just say that the way the mechanism works is, what we understand now is that it's an astronomical calculating machine. That's what Albert Rehm had recognized and realized. He was the first to really recognize that. And it works because it calculates repeating astronomical cycles. If you want to know the position of the moon, you need to follow its repeating cycles against the stars. And this Babylonian cycle, this 19-year cycle of the moon, a pretty accurate cycle that the moon goes through the zodiac 254 times, was found by Rehm in the inscriptions. And then it was found by Price in the actual gearing. And this was a major step forward by Price. He discovered this cycle embedded in the gearing. You could see how it calculated the average position of the moon. Now, Price got pretty much all the rest of the mechanism wrong. He did a famous gear diagram and all the gear trains in that, except this little gear train that calculates this lunar cycle. They're all wrong, which is where I came into research, actually. The first thing, I became very skeptical about Price's model on general grounds that it violated a principle in science, which is often called Occam's razor, after William of Ockham. I think he was a 13th century priest or something, which he said you should not multiply complexities unnecessarily. And what this meant and why this was important for my analysis was that Price's model was a very complicated model doing with rather simple outputs. They could have been reproduced with far simpler gearing. And this alarm bells ring with scientists when you have a theory that is far too complicated for its simple outputs. So I wrote a paper called Challenging the Classic Research, challenging this model. The next thing that I did was to propose that we carry out new investigations of the mechanism, and these were that we should do high-resolution 3D X-ray studies, and that we should use a technique invented by Tom Maltzbender of Hewlett-Packard for looking at the surfaces of the fragments. There's a lot of inscriptions on the plates on the fragments, and some of these you can see on the surface. And Tom invented a brilliant method of digital imaging for looking at and examining surface details with great clarity. So in 2005, together with a whole Anglo-Greek team of academics, 3 professors of astronomy, 2 Greek, 1 British, and several other people, we, after 5 years of struggle to get the permissions from the necessary Greek authorities, which was stretched my mental resources apart from anything else, because it was a 5-year struggle, we did actually manage to get a grant from the Leverhulme Trust, and we got a company called X-Tech Systems in the UK, led by a man called Roger Hadland, remarkable man called Roger Hadland, to bring an 8-ton X-ray machine, which they built for this project as a special prototype machine, which was fairly extraordinary because his company was at that stage failing. So it was a slightly madcap enterprise for a failing company to do. But Roger, I persuaded him, and he believed in it, and he came. And we then spent, in 2005, we first spent the time with Tom Maltzbender and his team looking at the surfaces of the fragments. And then we spent around 2.5, 3 weeks with X-Tech Systems, X-raying all 82 fragments. It was pretty difficult and fraught. The National Archaeological Museum in Athens had never quite encountered people like ourselves who started work at 7 in the morning and rarely left until at least 7 at night. But we got it all done with great difficulties. There were huge technical difficulties with this prototype machine, and they had to do all sorts of extraordinary things, but they were a wonderful team from X-Tech Systems. And then brought all this new data back, and it was a gold mine. It's had wonderful, wonderful things in it. And I was charged with looking at the mechanical structure of the device, while other people looked at the inscriptions. I don't know Greek. I can't read Greek. I was not at all qualified for that. But with my background as a mathematician, I think I was qualified to look at the logical structure of the gearing and how it worked. And the first discovery that I made was that it predicted eclipses. It's quite a long story, but the Babylonians introduced a wonderful eclipse prediction cycle called the Saros cycle, which is a 223 lunar month cycle, just over 18-year cycle, where an eclipse of either the sun or the moon will repeat after that period. And it repeats with a very similar repeat. And the repeats go on for 12 to 15 centuries. It's a very accurate and extraordinary cycle. And one of the numbers that Albert Rehm had found in this little fragment called fragment 19, where he found these numbers relating to cycles, was the number 223. And looking at putting together various fragments and scale divisions in the fragments, I worked out that it had the lower back dial mechanism had a scale with 4 turns with over 223 months. It had an eclipse prediction mechanism, and that on these scales, you can imagine that between some of the divisions, there were little groups of Greek letters and symbols, which I call glyphs. And it became clear that these must be the eclipse predictions. They were in the right places. They occurred once every 6 months, sometimes once every 5 months, sometimes in adjacent months, which is the pattern of eclipses in the astronomical record. So they were clearly the eclipse predictions. And I managed to decipher quite a lot of what they represented. A lot of them had a sigma in, and I realized that stood for Selene, the goddess of the moon, so that was a lunar eclipse prediction. Some of them had an eta in for Helios. It's like an H, an eta. And this is the god of the sun. Helios is the god of the sun. So those were clearly the solar eclipse predictions. And it had a lot of other information which we ended up deciphering. Not just myself, but some other academic colleagues as well.
Now, quickly, in the study of this object, part of the problem is that it's incomplete. Is this still an active archaeological site, this wreck? And this wreck appeared to be very special because it was essentially filled with a bunch of things that rich people in Rome or wherever it was going would have been interested in. So is it possible that further fragments might surface if there's current archaeological work going on at the wreck?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question to have. That since the 1900-1901 dive, there was a dive in 1954 from a diver called Dumas, who was part of Jacques Cousteau's team. You remember Jacques Cousteau did a lot of diving on ancient wrecks, studying ancient wrecks. And then his team came back in around, I think it was 1970 maybe, and did another quite extensive dive on the wreck. And they found quite a lot of interesting new artifacts, little bronze statuettes, a bunch of coins from Pergamum, which were evidently dated to 86 BC, so it gave a date after which the wreck must have happened, after 86 BC. And he found quite a lot of interesting stuff, not on the sort of scale that the original divers had brought up, because they'd really brought up hundreds and hundreds of interesting objects. And then about, I don't know, between 6, 7 years ago, I can't remember, there was another project to dive on the wreck called the Return to Antikythera project. And this project, run by, I can't remember his name at the moment, but anyway, a very able man from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in the USA and financed largely by Hublot Watches, which is a large luxury watchmaking company. They did this Return to Antikythera, and they used a lot of modern technology, underwater metal detectors, big robotic suits, and so on to discover items. And they spent quite, I think, several seasons on this. I wasn't part of this at all, so I don't know the details. And they did find some interesting things. They found some lead anchor weights. They found a bronze spear. They found a little bronze plaque with I think a bull on it, which they immediately thought was part of the Antikythera mechanism, but I knew immediately looking at it that it almost certainly wasn't. And they believed they might find some more bits of the Antikythera mechanism, which would have been the big prize, as it were. But my own view is that the original lump came up in one piece. It's in 82 fragments now. And the divers, they would never have found the other. We're pretty sure we know most of what's missing now, and what's missing, most of it isn't big enough to have survived. It would have, as a separate fragment, it would have just dissolved away. Perhaps the planetary mechanisms, which we believe were part of the sort of middle of the mechanism, could have survived. But my own view is it's extremely unlikely that they would find them. It's not impossible, extremely unlikely. I was more optimistic that they might find a second mechanism. We have no guarantee that this was a one-off mechanism. There might have been a second mechanism. And it was a hugely valuable device, even in it when it was made. It was like a luxury astronomical watch nowadays, very complicated and device, that there might have been more than one of them, but they didn't find anything like that. So the latest things have really not advanced our understanding of the Antikythera mechanism at all, you know. But returning to the after we discovered eclipse prediction, which was a major step forward, it left a huge problem about interpreting what was left, because within this system, there was a group of 4 gears that had been part of Price's model. He thought that there was a so-called differential in the system that calculated the phases of the moon. And this was one of the reasons I thought his work was wrong, because it calculated the phases of the moon in a very complicated, unnecessarily complicated way. But the gears were certainly there and didn't seem to make sense. And to cut a long and really hard story short, what these gears do, which is perhaps the most astonishing thing we know about the mechanism, is they calculated the variable motion of the moon through the zodiac. And in modern terms, we know that the moon doesn't go at a constant rate against the stars because it has an elliptical orbit. The ancient Greeks didn't know of elliptical orbits. So because it has an elliptical orbit, sometimes it's further away and it goes slower against the stars, and sometimes it's closer to it and it appears to go faster. But this variable motion was known to the ancient Greeks, known to the ancient Babylonian astronomers before them. And ancient Babylonian astronomy had a huge influence on ancient Greek astronomy. And it was known what cycles were involved with this variable motion, because the moon has several cycles. It has the familiar cycle we know about the moon is the lunar cycle, the so-called synodic cycle of its phases. Starts new moon, it goes to crescent moon, quarter moon, half moon, full moon, and then back to new moon. This is the so-called synodic cycle of the moon. It takes about 29 and a half days, just over that. But it also has this sidereal cycle, which Rem had found in inscriptions, which Price had found embedded in the gearing. But it has other cycles, and another cycle, very important cycle, is its so-called anomalistic cycle, its cycle of this variable motion from its slowest motion, where it's farthest away from the Earth, back to its slowest motion. And that's a different cycle to other cycles. And there was a beautiful ancient Greek theory of the moon called the epicyclic theory of the moon, which modeled this cycle in a beautiful way. It's not particularly accurate in modern terms, but it was an astonishing achievement. And what I found was that this system of gears calculated this extraordinarily sophisticated and beautiful cycle of the moon and output it on the front of the mechanism. It has a zodiac dial that shows the position of the moon, and it showed its variable motion. It's very subtle variable motion. It doesn't vary a lot from the average motion of the moon, but it's there, and it's embedded in the Antikythera mechanism.
Now, making the mechanism, whoever first did this. Now, is there any evidence that this object, when the ship went down, was already an antique, and that it may actually originate from deeper in the ancient Greek world, and that it was already a sort of renowned thing? And is there any record in the historical record of the Roman Republic or something like that that mentions devices like this? Might there have been others?
Yes. Well, this is a very good... There is controversy about the Antikythera mechanism as when exactly it was made. Some people believe it was made very close. The wreck has been pretty securely dated now to between 60 and 70 BC. And some people think that it was made close to this date. I personally believe that it was probably made in the late 3rd century BC, close to the date identified by Christian Carman and James Evans as being a date that related most closely to the eclipse prediction cycle depicted on the mechanism. Very technical arguments there. Now, there's a very intriguing and extraordinary historical text by Cicero. Cicero was a great statesman, politician, lawyer, orator in ancient Greece, a very celebrated figure. And he wrote about three devices actually. He wrote about 2 devices that the greatest scientist of the ancient world, Archimedes, had made, and 1 device that a Stoic philosopher, head of the Stoic philosophy school in Rhodes called Posidonius had made. And when you look at these descriptions, they sound just like the Antikythera mechanism. You know, the mechanisms that Archimedes made, they track the positions of the sun, moon, and the planets as they happen in night, and they track eclipses and everything. But they're pretty non-specific. They don't even say that the mechanisms were geared. I think it's almost certain that they were. And from this, I mean, Archimedes died in the siege of Syracuse, 212 BC, killed by a Roman soldier. Posidonius lived in the 1st century BC in Rhodes and was known to Cicero. So this is almost certainly a first-hand account by Cicero of the device Posidonius made, because he studied under Posidonius in the Stoic philosophy school he had in Rhodes. The devices made by Archimedes is earlier, but we can really only speculate from here, and it's easy to sort of run to definite conclusions when we don't have definite evidence. But my kind of speculative belief is that Archimedes founded the tradition of making these devices. He's supposed to have written a treatise called On Spherae, which is mentioned many hundreds of years later. And we have these descriptions of these two devices that he made. But he died in 212 BC. It's almost certainly too early for the Antikythera mechanism. So this is probably not one of the devices that Archimedes constructed. But again, I would speculate that it could well have been a device that was based on Archimedes' design. Archimedes was celebrated, even in the ancient world, he was celebrated for his incredible mathematical and scientific discoveries. So people might well have copied his designs. There's a lot of copying went on in the ancient world. Greek temples, they saw the Parthenon and they did a version of their own, a little bit different, a little bit smaller maybe. But a lot of things like Greek temples were copied ceaselessly. And, it's how technology develops, really. And so I think it's quite likely that Archimedes' design may well have been copied, and the Antikythera mechanism is a later copy of his design. And the other thing which sort of supports this is that the Antikythera mechanism is incredibly clever. It's incredibly clever. Every aspect of it is clever. Every time you discover something new on it, like this realization, this modeling of the variable lunar cycle, it is jaw-droppingly clever and ingenious and extraordinary. And who else but Archimedes could have designed that? Well, there were some other clever people in the ancient world. Apollonius of Perga could have been somebody, because he probably invented the planetary theories which are embodied in the mechanism. Or they knew each other, they might have collaborated on it, but everything really is pretty speculative. It would be nice to get a copy of Archimedes' thesis on Spherae, which could emerge from new discoveries. We don't know.
Well, there's still an entire group of carbonized papyri sitting in an unexcavated room in Pompeii. Who knows what'll come out of that? Although that tends
Herculaneum.
Yeah, Herculaneum, right.
Herculaneum.
It tends towards philosophy, but who knows what's in there. But the question about this, too, though, is that this object had to have had more than one person involved in its creation. And about schools of thought, we do this today. The watch companies of today did not invent the mechanical watch. They just refine it and work with it. And maybe that's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
But the question is that to build this device, you needed an astronomer and a mathematician, but also a master craftsman that could work with gears on a extremely high level basis for that time. The precision here is there is nothing comparable to this precision bronze working at the time. So you needed some very special, very skilled people even to build this device, even if they didn't invent it, right?
Yeah. I think there must have been a designer who was primarily a mathematician, astronomer, or maybe taking a design from a great scientist like Archimedes. And then there must have been a workshop of crafts people to make it, because I can't remember how many, in our latest model, there are 69 gears. They probably have an average of about 60 teeth on each of them. So you've got to hand make all those gear teeth. The inscriptions, there may be 25,000 text characters on them, on the plates, because they're very extensive inscriptions. And these were all minuscule. They were less than 2 millimeters high. Most of them around 1.6 millimeters high, very tiny text engraved in bronze sheet, and that was certainly a big labor, and almost certainly done by a team of people, I would guess. And the making of the gears and their arbors, as they're called in horological terms, they call the axles that they sit on, arbors, and the making of the bearings and all the scales. There's a graduated scale with 365 divisions around it for the year. There's another scale with 360 degrees around it to show the signs of the zodiac, and the zodiac signs are marked on the front of the mechanism. And this is just a huge amount of work. It was a very luxury object when it was made, very expensive object.
Now, what would it have been used for? I mean, would this have just been some rich person's novelty, or would this actually have, was somebody sitting there saying, I need to know when the next lunar eclipse is going to happen, and this is the device that I need to do that?
Well, it is essentially, it's a prediction device. Now, some people say it's really a sort of demonstration device to demonstrate to people the relative movements of all the astronomical bodies, the production of eclipses. But I personally think it's much more than that. I think it was certainly designed by a great scientist. And the thing is, it shows variable motions of these astronomical bodies. We discussed the variable motion of the moon, where all the gearing is there, which shows this. One or two missing gears, but they must have existed, including some extraordinary gears with 53 teeth, for example, which were necessary to calculate this variable motion. It almost certainly also included the variable motions of the planets. And the planets this was one of the basic, really hard problems for ancient astronomers, because if you look, say, at the planet Venus, sometimes it goes forward through the zodiac in so-called prograde motion. Then it comes to a halt, and it does a little backward loop in so-called retrograde motion, comes to a halt again, another stationary point, and then goes forward again. And all the planets do these sort of loopy variable motions. So the designer of the mechanism had to include these variable motions, incorporate them into the design. And this was done with epicyclic gears, as I said, gears mounted on other gears, coupled with pin and slot devices, which were devices where one gear turns another via one gear with a pin engages with a slot and a gear on top of it. This was discovered by Michael Wright, another very important pioneering researcher on the Antikythera mechanism. And Michael Wright actually observed this in the system of gears that I said calculates the variable lunar motion. He observed one gear with a pin on it and another gear sitting on top of it with a slot, a system that you might think is completely useless. They'll just turn around at the same rate. But he also discovered that they turn on eccentric axes. They don't turn on the same axes. The center of those axes is separated by about 1 millimeter. So this is reducing the subtle variable motion that's incorporated into the variable motion device for the moon. Michael Wright got the interpretation of this wrong because it didn't fit in with his model. But in my model with eclipse prediction, where the large gear which carry these small gears calculated the eclipse cycle, the 18-year cycle, gear goes around very slowly, and it worked. And I took Michael Wright's observation, and it worked in this model in a just brilliant way, to be honest. So there's been a long collaboration of a lot of scientists, and I've been really pleased to play my role in it, but there's been a whole history of scientists getting things right, but often getting things wrong, but in interesting ways, and then making more progress, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, this sort of thing. It's been a very, because the evidence is so fragmentary, it's been a very, very tough research history.
Now, is there enough in your model, the current model, that would allow a reconstruction of the device and to test it and see how accurate that thing was? Or are we still missing pieces to where we can't make it what we think is a reliable interpretation of it?
Well, that's an interesting question. Our latest model that we published, I published with a group from University College London, And one of our then PhD students, David Higgin, made very important contributions to the structure of the planetary system on it, a so-called cosmos gearing that calculates this beautiful front display of the ancient Greek cosmos. This is a complete working model. It may not be, I say it's complete, it may not actually be quite complete. There's one aspect missing, which I'm still working on, which I think was there, which I'm not going to talk about publicly at the moment because it's still work in progress. And I would very much like to see a model made on these lines. People have made some attempts to do it, but not quite got there. David Higgins started making a model, but he's not currently continuing it for complicated reasons, which I won't go into. So we don't actually have a physical working model of our ideas. Michael Wright has got one, which includes all the planets and so on, but I don't believe it's correct. I think there's quite a lot that's not correct, that doesn't match the evidence about it. But it was still a remarkable achievement, and it works. That's the main thing with Michael's models. They work, and you can turn them, and they turn smoothly. Remarkable, actually. He's made very important contributions to, well, both our models, actually, you know. And so after Price, Michael Wright was the next main researcher, you know, before the more recent work that me and my various collaborators undertook.
Now, this artifact takes us back to a time, a very interesting, innovative area in era of the ancient world, where we had not only Archimedes and those types of people working, we also had Heron of Alexandria making steam engines, essentially.
Yes.
Now, these objects, nothing ever came of it. We don't see this knowledge preserved with the Byzantines or something like that. It was lost knowledge, and that begs a question. I mean, if these things like this had been pursued, I mean, could the ancient Greeks have gotten to the point of building a mechanical clock, which seems to actually be less complex than the Antikythera mechanism was?
Yeah.
So if they would have applied this sort of knowledge into other areas, they might have hit upon inventions much earlier than what we actually did. So the question is why didn't they? What do you think was?
Well, I think this is an excellent question. Let me just deal with clocks to start with. They did not known before the 13th century. So, I don't know, 1,500 years after the Antikythera mechanism. The one thing the Antikythera mechanism wasn't, some people have suggested it could have been powered by a water clock. They had water clocks, which used dripping water to measure time. But mechanical clocks needed, the escapement wasn't invented until the 13th century, as far as we know. But the more general thing about the progress of technology from that point, the great scientist and science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke wrote that if the ancient Greeks had realized the full potential of their discovery in the Antikythera mechanism, we would not just merely be puttering around on the moon. We would have by now reached the nearest stars. The whole history of technology would have been accelerated much earlier date, than what actually happened. Well, it's speculative, but it's a very good question as to why the technology didn't develop. Why didn't they develop mathematical calculating machines like the adding machines and so on of the 17th century by Blaise Pascal and William Shikard and people like that? They made that these are not more complicated than the Antikythera mechanism, in many ways simpler. And the ancient Greeks had all the technology to do that. I just think they didn't, it was a completely different realm. So they didn't really think of doing that. Astronomy was the one thing in their lives where these cycles happened. Great cycles happened in astronomical terms, which they could model. And they looked around at the rest of the world and not much worked in that way, and they didn't think abstract numbers, calculating abstract numbers, which would have been a major step forward and didn't happen, as I said, till the 17th century, was something they could have easily accomplished. There's lots of things, and as you say, there were other technologies being developed here, and steam engine and lots of little pneumatic devices and other clever devices and water clocks and so on. but it just didn't seem, it wasn't a launch pad until much, much later. And then the development of clocks led into scientific instruments, led into the scientific and industrial revolutions, and things took off. But what is it, 1,500 years later? So, but I'm not a historian of technology, so you'll have to ask if anyone's got a good understanding of this. You know, technologies, if you look historically, they started and stopped. You know, ancient Chinese technology was very advanced at various stages, and then didn't develop and didn't percolate to the rest of the world. You know,
It's actually interesting because it looks almost like, I mean, it was situational. And if you look at the Roman Empire and you look at and ask the question, how did they see the future? Did they sit and act like Arthur C. Clarke and try to envision what their future would be? They didn't really do that. Instead, they simply saw it as a return to the golden times, you know, the return of happy days and things like that, where that was their vision of the future is the best possible outcome is what we hope for. So when you look at the mindset, it's very different than our technological society of today, where we relentlessly push forward with technology.
yeah.
They may not have seen the point.
The Romans were very innovative in terms of building technology. Their use of concrete, you know, was extraordinary. You know, look at the Pantheon in Rome. It's just absolutely amazing structure. And they had concrete that would set underwater and so on. And in terms of building development and technology, it was remarkable.
Which was also knowledge that was lost because by the Renaissance, they were trying to figure out what concrete was, what Roman concrete was.
Yes, it was. So technology we think of it as being progressing very quickly in a linear fashion, but it goes in stops and starts and setbacks, and people forget and so on, you know. One other thing I was going to say about people ask what the device was for. Well, if you look at all these theories of how the moon moved, the variable motion of the moon, you look at the theories of the variable motions of the planet, these loopy motions and so on. If you want to sit down, they're basically very simple. The theories are based on the addition of two circular motions. A circular motion, a so-called deferent, and a little epicycle turning on that at a different rate. So they're geometrically, they're simple. But if you want to actually calculate their consequences, you need trigonometry. Now, in Hellenistic times, that's the whole period from the death of Alexander the Great to basically the end of BC times, they were developing trigonometry. But it was pretty difficult. It was very difficult. If you wanted to calculate a single position of the moon in 2 years' time, according to this epicyclic theory of the moon, it would have taken you an hour or two to do it. You wanted to calculate the position of Mars in 6 months' time. You know, it would take you a long time to do the trigonometry. But with the Antikythera mechanism, you would just turn the input handle to the right date, and it would show you these positions, you know. If you wanted to calculate when the next full moon was, or new moon, this was where one trigonometric expression equals another. And I certainly couldn't find any analytical solution to that. When I wanted to know the answer of what the mechanism predicted, I had to use far more modern methods, a method called Newton-Raphson for getting the approximation of roots. And I used a spreadsheet to do it, and then it was quite quick. So you could argue that one of the purposes, maybe the primary purpose of the mechanism, was to do trigonometry, because it could do it immediately without you making any mathematical calculations at all. You could argue that the machine was a machine designed to do trigonometry.
Which is astonishing because is there any other attestation to the Greeks having had knowledge of trigonometry back then? I mean, could we come up with a document or something? Something comes out of
certainly they were studying trigonometry. I've got a book about it which I haven't yet read, so I can't talk with my authority about it. But Hipparchus, the great astronomer of BC times, the greatest Greek astronomer, he had a so-called table of chords, which was an early table of trigonometry for doing trigonometry. And there's a lot of evidence that they were developing trigonometry. But actually, it was the actual calculations were pretty long-winded and cumbersome and difficult. We take it for granted, mathematical notation. They didn't have that. Modern mathematical notation makes us shortcuts all our calculations and makes all the patterns of mathematics seem evident. But without that, it's pretty difficult stuff. But they were certainly doing trigonometry in ancient Greece.
A lot of work went into that glorious artifact. Well, anyway, Doctor, we are out of time, and I hope as your work continues, you'll come back and update us if you can find out more about this. And my hope is you can build one and we can see how it works in action.
Yeah, I would love to do that, because there are very, very interesting questions about how they built it. I mean, I'll just take one thing, if you just got a couple of minutes, is that the outputs at the front show the positions of the sun, the moon, and the planets. We're almost certain that this was in a sort of ring system, rotating concentric rings. And they must have been rotated by a set of nested tubes, a central but that showed the output from the moon, and a tube for each of the planets, for the true sun, and so on. In fact, 8 concentric tubes with walls maybe around 1 millimeter thick. Well, imagine making that in ancient Greece. That's a serious challenge. And we are trying to look at solutions to how they might have done that, because that is an incredibly difficult thing to do without modern machinery.
Over 120 years later, the mystery of this device continues.
Yes. There's still many, many secrets to be unraveled.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.